Charles Whitmore was a man everyone in the city knew by name. His name was always on the cover of business magazines, in headlines of newspapers, and spoken in conversations inside fancy restaurants. He was a billionaire who owned some of the biggest hotels, resorts, and luxury properties around the world. People admired his success and wanted to be like him, but those who worked for him often carried a different feeling: fear. Charles was not cruel, but he was known for being extremely strict, and his rules were followed as though they were carved in stone. Charles believed in order, control, and discipline. He had built his empire from almost nothing, starting as a young man with a single small property that he turned into a profitable business. Over the years, he added more hotels, more resorts, and soon expanded into airlines, real estate, and even international finance. His empire was vast, and with it came power. But with power, Charles also grew distant from ordinary people. He trusted rules more than emotions, and he valued control more than compassion. Inside his corporate world, Charles had many policies. Some were about dress codes, punctuality, or how employees should speak to clients. These rules were strict but fair, at least on the surface. Yet, one particular rule stood out from the rest, a rule that made even his closest employees uncomfortable but too afraid to question. Charles did not allow curvy black women to serve in visible positions in his company. No one could remember exactly when or why this rule had been made, but it was there, firm and unshakable. People whispered about it in hallways, wondering if Charles carried some personal bias or if it came from a painful memory in his past. But no one dared to ask him directly. This rule shaped the culture inside his empire. Women who fit that description were quietly directed away from front-facing jobs, no matter how qualified they were. They might be given paperwork roles, cleaning roles, or anything that kept them out of sight. Over time, employees got used to this unspoken law. They may not have liked it, but they understood that questioning it meant risking their careers. Charles was not a man who forgave easily, and once someone lost his trust, there was no coming back. Despite this, people admired Charles for his brilliance. He had a sharp mind that could solve problems no one else could. He could look at a failing business and turn it into a gold mine within a year. He understood numbers, deals, and negotiations better than anyone. What he did not understand, however, was people, at least not on an emotional level. He saw the world in terms of profit, loss, and risk. Human feelings were secondary to him, and kindness was often seen as weakness in his eyes. Charles lived in a glass tower that overlooked the city. His office on the top floor had tall windows with a view that stretched for miles. People who entered his office always felt small in front of him, not just because of his wealth, but because of the way he carried himself. He rarely smiled, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but commanding. His assistants often said that Charles did not need to raise his voice to be heard; his silence was enough to make people nervous. Every new employee learned quickly about the culture of his empire. They learned to dress neatly, to arrive early, to avoid personal conversations in meetings, and most importantly, to never cross his rules. Some tried to challenge him in small ways, but they did not last long. Charles valued loyalty and obedience, and anyone who wanted to survive in his company had to follow those values strictly. Over time, the story of his "no curvy black women" rule became almost like a legend inside the company. Some employees felt sad about it, some felt angry, but most stayed quiet. They reminded themselves that Charles was the reason they had jobs, the reason they lived in expensive apartments, and the reason they could provide for their families. In return, they gave him their silence. What no one knew was that Charles himself carried a secret burden. Years ago, when he was just starting out, he had been humiliated at a business event by someone he trusted. That person happened to be a woman who fit the description of the rule he later created. The memory of that betrayal stayed with him, and instead of healing, Charles built walls around his heart. His rule was not just about business, it was about protecting himself from the ghosts of his past. But instead of admitting his fear, he wrapped it in authority and called it policy. Outside the corporate walls, Charles was admired as a visionary. He donated to charities, gave speeches about success, and appeared as a guest on television shows. People saw him as a man who had it all: money, power, and influence. Yet, those who worked close to him often noticed how empty his personal life seemed. He never married, rarely spoke about family, and avoided deep friendships. He was surrounded by people but lived in loneliness. For Charles, rules filled the silence in his life. They gave him structure and protected him from surprises. He believed that if everyone followed his rules, the world would remain under his control. And for years, this belief seemed to work. His empire grew stronger, his wealth multiplied, and his image remained untouchable. But deep down, there was still something missing. Though he would never admit it, Charles felt the weight of isolation. He looked at others who shared laughter, warmth, and companionship, but he convinced himself that such things were distractions. Love, kindness, and emotional connection had no place in the empire he had built. At least, that was what he thought. Little did Charles know, his world was about to change. The rule that had gone unquestioned for years would soon be challenged. The carefully built walls he had created to protect himself would start to crumble. And it would all begin with a single woman walking through the doors of his company, a woman who would not only defy his rule but also force him to face the truth he had been running from for most of his life. The morning the company welcomed a new employee, the lobby of Whitmore Enterprises was busier than usual. Staff rushed back and forth with files in their hands, assistants answered calls, and security guards scanned ID cards at the entrance. Amid the usual rush, a woman stepped in through the tall glass doors. Her name was Amara Johnson. Amara was not the kind of person who tried to draw attention, yet wherever she went, eyes naturally turned toward her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a kind of grace that came from within rather than from flashy clothes or loud behavior. She was curvy, elegant, and undeniably beautiful. But more than her appearance, it was her presence that filled the space. She walked with steady steps, her posture straight, and her eyes calm. Amara had worked hard for every opportunity in her life. She came from a family that valued education and honesty. From a young age, she was taught to respect people regardless of their background and to never let fear stop her from moving forward. Her parents were not wealthy, but they gave her the best gift: belief in herself. With their encouragement, Amara studied business administration at university, graduating with honors. While many of her classmates sought quick success, she worked with patience and persistence, starting from smaller jobs and proving herself at each step. When Amara applied at Whitmore Enterprises, she did not expect to be hired so quickly. Her application had gone through multiple levels of screening, and within weeks, she was called for an interview. The panel was impressed not only by her qualifications but also by the way she handled tough questions. She spoke clearly, thought carefully, and answered with sincerity. Instead of trying to impress, she focused on being truthful. That honesty made her stand out. What Amara didn't know was that her selection stirred quiet tension among the staff. Some whispered that Charles Whitmore, the billionaire himself, would never approve of her because she broke his long-standing rule. Others believed it was only a matter of time before she was transferred to a back-office position. Yet, when the final approval letter came, it carried Charles's signature. Perhaps he hadn't noticed the details of her profile. Or perhaps fate had played its hand, slipping Amara into a role that no one expected. On her first day, Amara was assigned to the executive floor, the heart of the empire where decisions worth millions of dollars were made every day. She would be working as a junior assistant in a department that often collaborated directly with Charles. It was a rare opportunity for someone new, but her managers felt she could handle the responsibility. Walking into the sleek, marble-lined corridors, Amara noticed how everyone around her seemed alert and cautious. Employees greeted one another politely but without warmth. It was as though the entire atmosphere was designed to remind people they were in the presence of power. Amara, however, did not let it unsettle her. She smiled, introduced herself kindly to her colleagues, and carried on with her tasks. Her first week was filled with paperwork, scheduling, and sitting in on meetings. While others kept their distance from her, Amara showed no signs of nervousness. She took careful notes, listened attentively, and offered helpful suggestions when asked. In one meeting, when a scheduling conflict seemed impossible to resolve, Amara proposed a solution that allowed both parties to agree without delay. Her calm voice and logical explanation surprised the room. People exchanged glances, impressed by how quickly she found clarity in a messy situation. News of her performance began to travel. Some admired her skill, while others whispered that her presence was dangerous. "The boss won't like this," one employee muttered in the cafeteria. "She doesn't fit the rule." Another shrugged and said, "But maybe the boss hasn't noticed yet. If she keeps proving herself, who knows what might happen." What no one realized was that Charles had indeed noticed. From his glass office at the top, he was aware of everything that happened on his floor. He had seen Amara enter the building on her first day. He had watched her in the conference room, quietly listening, then confidently speaking when necessary. He had noticed how she treated people not with fear or with the need to impress, but with genuine respect. At first, Charles told himself she was just another employee. He reminded himself of his rule, the line he had drawn long ago, and the reasons behind it. Yet, something about Amara disturbed his certainty. She was not trying to challenge him. She was not trying to seek attention. She was simply doing her job with excellence, and in doing so, she was challenging the unfair belief he had carried for years without even knowing it. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's reputation grew. Her colleagues, who had first kept their distance, slowly began to approach her. They asked for her advice, shared tasks with her, and found comfort in her calmness. She became a quiet force of stability in an office often ruled by fear of making mistakes. Even when senior managers raised their voices, Amara remained composed, solving problems step by step. Outside of work, Amara lived a simple life. She rented a modest apartment in the city, enjoyed cooking her own meals, and often spent evenings reading or calling her family. She did not chase luxury or attention. She believed that success was measured not just by money, but by integrity. Her values guided her in everything she did, and they showed clearly in the way she carried herself. Meanwhile, Charles struggled silently with his thoughts. He tried to remind himself of the past, of the reason he had created that rule, but the more he observed Amara, the weaker his reasoning became. She was the opposite of the assumptions he had made. She was professional, kind, and highly capable. Where he had once expected flaws, he found strength. Where he expected distraction, he found focus. Slowly, against his will, Charles began to pay attention to her more than he wanted to admit. The staff began to notice too. Some joked quietly that Amara had broken the invisible law. Others wondered how long it would be before the billionaire himself spoke to her. Amara, however, was unaware of these whispers. She was focused only on doing her best, day after day, never imagining that she had already begun to shift the atmosphere of the empire she had joined. Little did she know, her calm presence was not just earning respect among her colleagues, it was reaching the one man whose rules had defined the company for decades. The billionaire who had once believed his policies were unshakable was slowly being tested. And Amara, without trying, was becoming the first person in years to challenge the walls he had built around his heart. As weeks passed, Amara's presence in the office grew harder to ignore. Her colleagues had started to admire her steady nature, but Charles Whitmore found himself caught in a battle within his own mind. He was not a man who liked disruptions, and yet, here was Amara, a disruption that didn't come in the form of mistakes or carelessness, but in the form of quiet excellence. Charles had built his empire by controlling every detail. He demanded punctuality, perfection, and silence when needed. People followed his instructions as though they were commands from a king. But Amara was different. She did not defy his rules directly, yet she had a way of making the office feel warmer, calmer, and more human. Where others looked nervous under his gaze, she stood steady. Where others stammered, she spoke with clarity. It unsettled him, because for years, his authority had gone unquestioned. The first time Charles noticed her closely was during a tense board meeting. A major deal with an international partner was at risk of falling apart due to scheduling issues and miscommunication. Senior managers spoke in rushed voices, offering half-formed solutions, while Charles listened with his usual cold expression. The atmosphere was heavy, and no one wanted to say the wrong thing. In the corner of the room, Amara quietly raised her hand. The entire board turned toward her with surprise. A junior assistant, speaking in front of executives and the billionaire himself, was almost unheard of. Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gave a small nod, allowing her to speak. With calm confidence, Amara explained how the schedule could be rearranged without either party losing their advantage. She pointed out the overlooked details, showing how the problem was simpler than everyone had assumed. Her voice was steady, her reasoning clear, and her tone respectful. When she finished, the room fell silent. Charles studied her carefully. He was used to people either fearing him or trying to impress him. Amara did neither. She simply offered a solution as though it was her duty, then sat back quietly, not expecting praise. After a long pause, Charles spoke, "We'll go with her plan." His voice was calm, but those in the room could feel the weight of his words. The meeting moved on, but the moment stayed with him. Afterward, whispers spread across the executive floor. "Did you see that?" someone said. The billionaire actually agreed with her idea. Others shook their heads in disbelief. This has never happened before. Amara, however, did not bask in the attention. She went back to her desk, typing calmly as though nothing unusual had happened. For Charles, the incident marked the beginning of an unexpected shift. He found himself noticing her more often, not just in meetings, but in the way she interacted with people. When a receptionist spilled coffee in the lobby, Amara was the first to help her clean up without making a scene. When a junior staff member forgot an important file, Amara offered guidance instead of criticism. These small actions did not fit the image Charles had built of employees being either useful or replaceable. She treated people like people, not tools. One afternoon, Charles passed by the break room and overheard Amara talking to a group of staff members. She was telling a simple story about her childhood, how her mother used to remind her that respect was more powerful than wealth. The staff laughed and listened with ease, something rarely seen in the company. Charles lingered by the doorway longer than he meant to. For a man who believed warmth was weakness, he couldn't understand why her words unsettled him so deeply. The more Charles tried to keep his distance, the more his attention returned to her. He told himself it was only curiosity. He convinced himself he was simply observing an employee who had caught others' interest. Yet, late at night, as he sat in his glass office overlooking the city, he caught himself replaying the sound of her calm voice in his mind. It was unfamiliar territory for him, a man who had avoided personal connections for most of his life. Amara, meanwhile, remained unaware of the silent struggle she had triggered. To her, Charles was just her employer, demanding, distant, but fair when it came to business. She treated him with respect, but she did not fear him the way others did. She saw him as a man, not an untouchable figure. When he gave instructions, she listened carefully. When she had questions, she asked them politely without hesitation. Her steady approach made Charles notice something he hadn't seen in years: honesty without fear. This balance between them soon led to small but significant moments. One evening, as Charles prepared for an important overseas meeting, a technical problem delayed the video conference setup. The technicians scrambled, whispering nervously, afraid of his reaction. Charles was about to step in when Amara calmly walked forward. She asked the technicians a few simple questions, offered a clear solution, and within minutes, the system was running smoothly. Charles watched silently as the tension in the room faded, not because of his authority, but because of her composure. After the meeting, he found himself speaking to her directly for the first time. "You handled that well," he said in his low, even tone. Amara smiled politely and replied, "I only did what was needed, sir." It was a simple exchange, but for Charles, it carried weight. Most people sought his approval, but she treated his words with quiet respect, not desperate gratitude. It made him realize she was different. The staff continued to gossip. "Something is changing," one said. "The billionaire never talks to junior assistants." Another replied, "Maybe she's just lucky. Or maybe she's the first one who isn't afraid of him." They didn't know how right they were. For Charles, every interaction with Amara became a mirror, showing him the cracks in the rules he had once thought unbreakable. He had spent years believing that control meant strength, but watching her, he began to wonder if strength could also mean kindness. He had built walls to protect himself, but Amara's quiet presence was like sunlight slipping through the cracks. Of course, Charles did not admit this to anyone, not even to himself. Outwardly, he remained the same strict, disciplined billionaire. He continued to enforce punctuality, order, and structure. But inside, something was shifting. The rule he had once defended with iron certainty now seemed fragile in the face of a truth he could no longer deny. Amara was proving that character mattered more than appearance, and strength could exist in compassion. As the days went by, the silent tension between them grew. Amara continued her work with dedication, unaware that she had become the center of a change larger than herself. And Charles, though still holding onto his pride, began to realize that his empire, built on cold rules, was slowly being warmed by the quiet influence of one woman. What neither of them knew was that this was only the beginning. The real test was yet to come, moments that would force Charles to decide whether to hold onto his walls or to break his own rule. For the first time the weeks turned into months, and Amara's role inside Whitmore Enterprises grew more important than anyone could have imagined. At first, she was a quiet assistant in the background, but slowly, she became a voice people listened to when things grew complicated. Managers who once ignored her began seeking her advice, and team members trusted her judgment even in matters beyond her official duties. Charles Whitmore noticed all of it. He noticed how meetings went smoother when Amara was present, how arguments died down when she spoke calmly, and how staff who were once nervous seemed more at ease around her. For years, his empire had been ruled by fear of mistakes, fear of failure, fear of disappointing him. Yet, without even trying, Amara was changing that. She wasn't loud or forceful, but her presence softened the sharp edges of the corporate atmosphere. For Charles, this was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He had spent most of his life believing that control was the only way to protect what he had built. He had believed that strict rules and distance from others would keep his empire strong. But Amara's influence showed him something he had forgotten: people worked better when they felt respected, not when they felt afraid. The first true test of this came one afternoon during a critical negotiation with international investors. The room was tense, filled with sharp suits and sharper words. The investors were threatening to pull out unless Charles agreed to terms that would weaken his company. Charles sat at the head of the table, listening with a calm face but burning with frustration inside. As the discussion grew heated, Amara, who was present only to take notes, spoke up softly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Everyone turned to look at her. She then explained a middle path, a compromise that neither side had considered. Her reasoning was clear, and her tone carried quiet authority. The investors exchanged glances, then nodded slowly. Charles leaned back in his chair, watching as the impossible deal was salvaged not by his decades of experience, but by the insight of a woman who was never supposed to have a voice in that room. After the meeting, Charles found himself walking beside her in the corridor. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he spoke, "You changed everything in there." Amara glanced at him, her expression calm. "I only did what I thought was fair, sir." Her words stayed with him long after she had left. It was not flattery, not ambition, just fairness. For a man who had spent years living behind walls of rules and pride, her honesty felt like fresh air. From then on, Charles began to rely on Amara more than he intended. He asked her to attend more meetings, not just to take notes, but to observe. He began to ask her opinion privately afterward. At first, she hesitated, unsure if it was truly her place, but her natural honesty guided her. She spoke what she believed, even if it disagreed with him. And to his own surprise, Charles found himself listening. This closeness did not go unnoticed by the staff. Whispers grew louder. "The billionaire is breaking his own rule," they said in hushed voices. "He trusts her more than anyone else." Some were supportive, admiring the change. Others were skeptical, certain that it would end in disaster. But Amara paid no attention to the gossip. She continued her work with quiet dedication, never asking for more than what was given. Charles, however, could not ignore the whispers in his own mind. Every time he looked at Amara, he was reminded of the rule he had set years ago. A rule meant to protect him from pain, a rule meant to keep him in control. Yet here he was, trusting the very person he once swore would never have a place in his world. The contradiction gnawed at him. One late evening, long after most employees had left, Charles sat in his office with the city lights glowing beneath the glass windows. Amara entered quietly to drop off some documents. Seeing him still at his desk, she asked gently, "Don't you ever get tired?" Charles looked up, surprised by the question. People rarely spoke to him that way. He paused before answering. "Work doesn't tire me. People do." Amara smiled softly. "Maybe it's not the people, it's the walls you build around them." Her words struck him more deeply than she realized. For a man who prided himself on never letting emotions show, he felt something shift inside. She had seen through him, not as an employee looking at a powerful boss, but as a human being looking at another. He didn't reply, but her words echoed in his mind long after she left the room. Over the next weeks, Charles noticed small changes in himself. He found himself speaking with less harshness, allowing space for others to share ideas. He found himself walking through the office and noticing smiles where there had once been only tension. Without planning it, he was softening not because he wanted to, but because Amara's influence had made it possible. The moment of truth came during a company celebration held at one of his luxury hotels. It was a formal event, filled with investors, managers, and high-profile guests. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, moving gracefully through the grand ballroom. Charles entered with his usual air of authority, but his eyes quickly searched for one person. When he saw Amara across the room, speaking kindly with a group of junior employees, he felt something stir in him that no wealth or power had ever given. Guests approached Charles, offering handshakes and praise, but his attention drifted back to her. He realized then what he had been denying: the rule he had carried for so long no longer had power over him. It was not just that Amara had proven herself capable, it was that she had shown him a truth he had been afraid to face. Rules built from fear could not protect a man forever. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Charles found himself standing near Amara. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, struggling with the weight of what he wanted to say. Finally, in a voice quieter than usual, he admitted, You've made me question everything I thought I knew. Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression gentle. Sometimes questioning is the first step to real change. For the first time in years, Charles allowed himself to smile, not the cold smile he reserved for cameras, but a genuine one. In that moment, he knew the rule he had lived by for so long had already been broken. Not with rebellion, not with defiance, but with quiet truth. The billionaire who once believed he could control every part of his world realized that he could not control his heart. And though he had not yet spoken the words aloud, he knew Amara had become more than just an employee. She was the reason he was rediscovering the man he thought he had lost to pride and fear. What Charles did not know yet was that the journey was far from over. Breaking the rule was only the beginning. The real transformation would come when he finally chose to let go of the past completely and embrace the future that stood right before him. The weeks after the company's celebration brought a quiet but steady change inside Whitmore Enterprises. For years, the air of the company had been filled with formality, strict silence, and an invisible fear of disappointing the man at the top. But now, the atmosphere was shifting. People were still professional, still hard-working, but there was something different, an energy of hope, a being heard. Amara did not set out to create this change, yet it was happening because of her. The way she carried herself, the way she listened to people, and the way she solved problems without arrogance had begun to ripple through the entire workplace. Managers became more approachable, staff started to share ideas openly, and even the executives who once kept tight lips in meetings found themselves speaking more freely. At the center of all of this was Charles Whitmore. He had not announced any new policies. He had not told people to change. But the change in him was visible, and when the leader of an empire begins to change, everyone else follows. Charles found himself thinking often about his past, about the walls he had built and the rule that had kept people like Amara out of his sight for so long. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but he knew that rule had been born from fear. It had been a shield to protect him from facing an old wound, something he had carried since his early years in business. Yet now, watching Amara each day, he realized that shield had not protected him at all. It had only isolated him. One evening, as the office grew quiet and the lights of the city glowed through the tall glass windows, Charles asked Amara to stay behind after a meeting. She entered his office with her usual calm, carrying a folder of reports. "Sit down," Charles said, his tone softer than usual. Amara took a seat, her eyes steady on him. She sensed something important was coming. For a long moment, Charles was silent, his hands resting on the desk. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know about the rule?" Amara blinked in surprise. She had heard whispers about it but never allowed herself to focus on gossip. She nodded slightly. "Yes. People mention it sometimes." Charles looked down, almost ashamed. "It was mine. I made that rule years ago. I told myself it was about business, but in truth, it was about fear. I thought if I kept certain people away, I could stay in control. But I see now how wrong I was." Amara listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but kind. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak, something few people had ever done for him. "I built this empire with rules, Amara," Charles continued, his voice low. "But you showed me something I had forgotten. Strength doesn't come from walls. It comes from honesty, from respect, from people like you." The room fell silent. Charles rarely revealed his inner thoughts, but now, for the first time in years, he was allowing someone to see his vulnerability. Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Sometimes rules can keep us safe for a while. But if they keep us from seeing the truth, they end up hurting more than protecting." Her words touched him deeply. He realized she wasn't judging him. She wasn't angry or resentful. She understood, and in that understanding, she gave him the courage to finally let go. From that day forward, Charles made deliberate changes. He quietly removed the unspoken rule from his company culture. He encouraged his managers to judge employees only on their skills, integrity, and dedication, not on appearances. For the first time in years, he walked into his offices not as a man feared by everyone, but as a leader who listened. The change was slow, but it was real, and people felt it. Amara, however, remained the same. She continued her work with the same dedication and grace as always. She never sought recognition, though she was now admired by almost everyone in the company. Her influence was undeniable, but she carried it humbly. For Charles, the transformation went beyond business. In private moments, he began to realize how much Amara had changed his personal life as well. He found himself speaking to her not only about work but about his thoughts, his worries, and even his memories. She listened patiently, never interrupting, never trying to take advantage. For a man who had lived so long in loneliness, those conversations felt like sunlight after years of shadows. One afternoon, while walking through one of his luxury hotels, Charles paused to watch Amara speaking with a group of staff members. They were laughing, their faces relaxed, and Amara stood at the center, guiding them with warmth. Charles felt something stir inside him, a realization that went beyond respect, beyond admiration. He cared for her, not as an employer cared for an employee, but as a man cared for someone who had touched his life in a way no one else ever had. Yet, Charles was cautious. He did not want to cross the line of professionalism too quickly. He respected her too much to treat her as anything less than an equal. So, he let the connection grow naturally, letting time and honesty shape it. Eventually, the truth could no longer be denied. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Charles and Amara walked out of the office together. The city was alive with lights, cars rushing by, and people moving in every direction. They stopped near the entrance, the cool night breeze brushing past them. Charles turned to her, his expression calm but sincere. "Amara, you've done more than just change this company. You've changed me. For years, I lived by rules that kept me apart from others. But you showed me what I was missing. And I don't want to go back to that empty life." Amara's eyes softened. She said nothing at first, but the gentle smile on her face spoke volumes. In that moment, Charles felt free not from his empire, not from his responsibilities, but from the chains of his own fear. He realized that true power was not in controlling people but in connecting with them. And he knew, without a doubt, that Amara had been the one to show him that truth. From then on, Charles's life was different. His empire continued to grow, but more importantly, so did the respect and loyalty of his people. Employees worked not because they feared him, but because they believed in him. Investors trusted him not only for his sharp mind but for his renewed vision of leadership. And through it all, Amara remained by his side not as someone who fit a role he once tried to forbid, but as the very person who helped him find his humanity again. The billionaire's rule had been clear once: no curvy black women in his company's spotlight. But life has a way of breaking even the strongest walls. In the end, it was Amara who walked through those doors and turned his world upside down. She didn't break his rule with rebellion, she broke it with truth, grace, and the kind of strength that no empire could ever contain. And Charles Whitmore, the man who once believed he could control everything, learned the greatest lesson of his life: sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves only keep us from the very people who can change us for the better.